Welcome to our next episode of Spill the Facts. My name is Yuborn Allicock, and I will be one of your moderators for tonight. As you all are aware, for the past few weeks, we have been doing some work. We've been doing some work on basically confronting anti-Blackness, speaking on somehow reshaping the mindset of those who feel that their skin color is somewhat of a stigma, their hair texture, their genetic makeup, every single thing that basically speaks against us as Black people. We're somehow trying to see how we can fight against it. And this is what we're trying to do in some of these informative and educative sessions. So once again, I would like to welcome each and every one of you who are tuning in to this episode of Spill the Facts. And the theme of tonight would be Confronting Anti-Blackness in 2020, the African male experience. We have a diverse panel of tonight, but before we get into that, I would like to introduce our co-speaker, Mr. Matthew Gaul.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. As Yuborn rightfully said, tonight we'll be exploring the topic, Confronting Anti-Blackness in 2020, the African male experience. And last week we began this docu-series where we focused on the African female experience, and we had a lovely session. I wish if we can have another session with the ladies another time, but tonight we're focusing on the men, and we have a short video for you guys. These videos were submitted to the youth committee, ranging from persons locally, regionally, and internationally. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
The first time I actively had to deal with racism was when I first moved to the United Kingdom. I lived in an area that was predominantly Caucasian. And you know, it started a bit gradually. You get those funny looks and those stares like you're out of place, you didn't belong. And this one afternoon, I'll never forget, I was coming home from college, and some kids around the age of 9 or 10, they saw me and started shouting the N-word. And I was in so much shock because this has never happened to me before. And you know that because they're kids, they had to learn this somewhere. This is what their family or their parents taught. This is what they're picking up from their environment. And it was a complete culture shock for me. And then it also allowed me to remember that I am a Black male and I will face things like these sometimes, unfortunately. But it was so blatant, it was such a shock to me.
It relates to my experiences in Africa anyways. I wouldn't go as far as to say that I was plagued with challenges or that I was constantly being oppressed, but it definitely wasn't easy. You had to constantly be aware of your surroundings and the fact that you were a young Black man. You know, growing up, my parents were very protective. They wouldn't let me go out after 6 or after dark, and you would wonder. I used to think that they were being controlling and being harsh and being too protective, but really it was for my own good. They were really trying to protect me, because during these times you would hear stories about young Black men being killed and arrested and whatnot. So they were really protecting me, and you had to be aware of the fact that you weren't entitled to some of the privileges that other people were entitled to. I used to catch Enterprise bus from school every day coming home growing up as a child. And as I got older, I started to realize that bus drivers and conductors would handpick the passengers that they want to go in their bus. They would literally park their bus around the corner from the park, through a street by the park, walk from there to the park and hand select people to go in their bus. So
hi, I am Adrian Thomas from Trinidad and Tobago. I currently reside in Beijing, China. Having grown up in Trinidad and Tobago, a small country where persons of many races live together side by side, moving to China, a largely homogeneous society, has been eye-opening, particularly as it pertains to me and the meaning of blackness. Like in other parts of the world where black culture is widely embraced, including black music, black fashion, and black sporting excellence, there's a lot of work to be done here in removing biases towards persons of African descent. As part of the global discussion on Black lives, further recognition of the International Decade of Persons of African Descent is most timely.
Good day, I'm Daniel Campbell, Vincentian Civil Engineer. I could say for a fact that systemic racism, Israel, anti-blackness, Israel. I've been told on several occasions, both by black and white prominent business persons, that in order to succeed in the Caribbean, I can't be the face of the operations. I will have to get a white, preferably foreign, especially British engineer or businessman to head my operations, because no one would ever trust a black person with that sort of money or that sort of responsibility.
Dealing with racism in North America has actually been a life-changing experience. Growing up in a place in the Caribbean that's 98% black, and then moving to North America where the demographics are shifted greatly, it kind of makes you self-conscious and more aware. And at one point, being pulled over by a white police officer, driving home, being asked a bunch of questions that seemed to be particularly invasive, and then given, I would say, a bogus excuse as to why I was pulled over, meaning saying that I was swerving within a lane, not between lanes, not driving too fast, not driving too slow, but swerving within my own lane, which is not illegal in any way or form. It gives you, or gives credence to the idea of driving while black.
Hi, my name is Joash Liebert, and I am from the lovely Twin Island Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. My experience involves one in which I was walking on my way home from college, and ahead of me on the street was this white lady, and she had some bags that she had rested on the sidewalk. And as I began to approach her, I realized that she picked the bags up and she started holding them in her hands. I didn't really think anything of it. I passed her, I said good afternoon, I didn't receive a response, and I just kept on my journey. But maybe like a couple of seconds after, something told me to just look back. And so I did. And when I looked back, the bags were back on the sidewalk, and she was just as she was before I had passed.
My experience of anti-blackness. In college, I had a philosophy 101 professor, a tenured professor who had been teaching that class for some time, explained to me that he skipped 1,000 years of history because it wasn't important. It was merely the Dark Ages. When he said that, he was looking me dead in my eye, very much with an earnest, honest look in his eye. But what I knew from just having knowledge of history was that Spain was conquered by the Moors in 711 AD, and that they ruled Spain for 800 years, and that they provided for the Renaissance that Europe wound up having thereafter. They introduced astrology, astronomy, chemistry, mathematics, as well as different techniques to navigate the world. When I looked into my teacher's eyes and realized that he was knowingly misleading me, I realized that the system is well put together to achieve its goal, and that we have to learn to think for ourselves, to love ourselves, and to gain control over our community. Knowledge itself, buy Bitcoin. Economic power.
Like I said, tonight we have a group of diverse speakers, ranging from Mr. Kidackie, Amsterdam, Mr. Ronald Daniels, and Mr. Michael Ralph. Mr. Kidackie, Amsterdam is an educator, community, cultural, and political activist. He has been involved in community and political activism for more than 2 decades. Within his community, Buxton, he served as a volunteer and eventually the coordinator of the free lessons and library program, known as the Lessons Place, until its discontinuation during the period of troubles. He has served as an executive member of the 1st of August movement in Buxton, which planned and executed several projects, including the annual UC Kayan Symposium, aimed at the economic and social development of the community. He is the founding member of SAGE, the Society of African Guyanese Empowerment Buxton chapter. Within this organization and with the support of the SLED program, he organized and executed skill training for youth who left the formal educational system. In his role as Community Action Officer with the Citizen Security Strengthening Program, he was able to identify and to coordinate skills and entrepreneurial training for at-risk youth. Next, we have Mr. Michael Ralph. Mr. Michael Ralph teaches in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the School of Medicine at the New York University. Mr. Michael is the recipient of a number of fellowships, including for advanced study in Princeton, Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in the U.S. History, and the W.E.B. Dubais Fellowship, among others. Michael is writing, directing, and producing the forthcoming animated short film, Fishing, about how ingenuity cannot be incarcerated. Mr. Michael has 2 newer medical anthropology research projects. Life explores how the US insurance industry affixes monetary value to human, breaking with the consensus among historians that slave insurance is distinct from life insurance because slaves were legally classified as property. Michael demonstrates that life insurance was built from the legal rationale and commercial logic of marine insurance and later slave insurance. Michael is also engaged in ethnogeographic research in Entrit concerning accommodations called MART certificates that the state prepares for families of veterans who died during more than 3 decades of warfare with Ethiopia in order to secure and defend their independence. Finally, we have Mr. Ronald Daniels. Mr. Daniels hails from the mining town Linden. He's a son, husband, and father. He is a son, husband, and father roles in which he invests himself fully. His chief passion is to serve others. He has always been committed to lending himself unconditionally to improving the lives of his countrymen. Mr. Ronald, as he prefers to be called, is a graduate of Central High School. He is a qualified surveying technician and civil and building engineering technician. He practices as an attorney at law in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. He is a senior associate at Hughes, Fields, and Stobie Law Firm. Ronald is an avid reader. He writes extensively on topical, local, legal, and social and political issues. He aspires always to treat in a balanced and objective way the issues he writes about. His passion and commitment in eternal service to his fellow Guyanese. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce you guys to our first speaker, Mr. Kidackie, Amsterdam. Mr. Amsterdam, over to you.
Good evening. Can you hear me loud? Am I clear enough? Good evening.
You are. I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Thank you, Yuborn, and thank you, IDPADA-G. Thank you, my fellow panelists, for this opportunity this evening. It's indeed a pleasure to be able to talk to, in this instance, I assume younger folks than myself. And I'm indeed happy that I could have that confidence reposed in me. But let me go straight into what the discourse is about. And that is confronting anti-Black racism. What is the African male experience? I want to start by establishing the fact that in my mind and in the mind of scholars, anti-Black racism is not by chance occurrence. It's mostly a systematic occurrence. It's a part of the system that has been designed to keep Blacks downtrodden. It can be traced back to the experiences of our ancestors during and immediately after slavery. This systemic occurrence, as I call it, anti-Black racism, is certainly made up of policies and practices which are rooted in institutions, whether they be educational, healthcare, the justice system, economic system, etc. They're all policies and practices which reside there, and they reflect and reinforce those beliefs and attitudes, the prejudices of other people toward Black, not only in Guyana, but across the universe. Of course, we see these prejudices giving life to themselves, or being given life in the form of the various discriminatory practices which we constantly encounter as a people. And when I talk about the experiences which our ancestors would have had, and the experiences which we continue to have, I'm reflecting particularly to that period immediately after slavery, when there were what should I say, deliberate efforts. There were deliberate efforts to ensure the failures of our ancestors who would have invested, having come off of the plantation, invested whatever monies they would have earned during the emancipation period, or the apprenticeship period, as some will refer to it. Those monies which were invested to acquire villages and set out on a path that hopefully would have led to economic independence, we would have seen anti-Black practices during that period in the form of these deliberate efforts to sabotage the Black communities, whether it was by flooding their farmlands or changing policies that will prevent acquisition of lands and prevent certain development from taking place in the communities. So, in essence, that formed a part of the system. And then, of course, there were those rules which were designed, again, to keep blacks out of the economy in terms of what you can participate in, what you can benefit from, what you can invest in. I remember as a youngster, and when we reflect in the community, we still have this kind of discussion. The elders of Buxton having this eternal fear of lending institutions. I remember that growing up because of their experiences with the system in those days. From what I have learned, many of them, or many villages, would have lost their inheritance, would have been cheated out of property and other possessions because they dared to engage with the lending institutions of the day. And those experiences have really driven, as we like to say, the fear of God into many of our people. And to a large extent, dictates whether or not they engage in lending, engage in borrowing from these institutions as a means of acquiring capital to strengthen their economic position. And these kind of manipulations continue even unto today. Because if you were to look at what we might call modern Guyana, you would realize to a large extent that blacks participate in the banking system as depositors for the greater part. Blacks make up a large percentage of the clientele of the mostly non-blacks owned financial institutions in this country. But if you were to compare the rate of their deposits with the ability or the opportunities that they have to be favorably considered for substantial loans, for investment and other such life-changing activities, you will come to realize the disparity. That is, we deposit a whole lot, but we benefit a very little from the services of the banks. Again, not by mistake, but by design. It's a part of the system of anti-black racism and discrimination. These policies, for the greater part, force our people to be relegated to the public service for employment. We know that the public service is where we receive inadequate income and we pay the greater portion of the country's tax bill. In other words, I'm saying blacks, for the greater part, are employed in the public service, where the wages are not premium, but you can bet and sure that every month you have to pay what is considered your share of the country's tax bill. Unlike, in many instances, the other people who participate in the quote-unquote business sectors, informal sectors, and avoid paying the taxman on a monthly or yearly basis. Now, again, I see that as part of the system of ensuring that blacks remain down-pressed, economically challenged, and disadvantaged. Why would I say that? Let me reflect on the years of the PPP administration. And I'm using this to establish the fact that the majority of blacks being employed in the public sector would have experienced policies which were anti-black and designed, like I said earlier, to keep them economically down-pressed. Remember the years of the PPP government when the public sector was always offered not more than 5% increase in wages and salaries. And when the representatives in terms of the trade unions dared to challenge the government, they were criticized and had to engage in strike actions and so on, which for the greater part have never really changed that imposition of 5%. But while that was happening to the public service, employees of Gaisuku, an industry which employed for the greater part people who are non-blacks, was allowed through their unions to bargain for increased wages and salaries, despite the fact that the industry, the corporation was bankrupt and had to be dependent on subventions from the government to stay afloat. So I'm using that to show the difference in treatment in terms of two different sets of people, where they were employed and what was the government's policies towards those different sectors. Now, I'm sure it's easy for us to agree that discriminatory practices, especially in terms of income and income generation and lack of access to capital by way of borrowing from the financial institutions and so on, would have had a negative impact on the economic, on the financial growth of blacks in the Guyanese society. But yet, our positions have been criticized. We have been criticized by others as being unsuccessful at business because we are poor managers, or because we are lazy, or because we prefer to sport. That whole general stereotyping of the black man. And we experience that consistently from others. But while they stereotype us with these kinds of descriptions, what they have not acknowledged or do not acknowledge is the fact that when our foreparents were emancipated from the slave plantations, the little money that they accumulated during the apprenticeship period, they invested that money immediately, all of that money, all of that capital, into the acquisition of lands and the establishment of villages and the payment for the development of those villages, and therefore had no real access to capital for business growth and development, having invested all that they had into the acquisition of these villages. Compared to the fact that the other people, more particularly the indentured immigrants, East Indians, at the end of their period, they were not only given lands, but they were also given financial rewards, which they were able to invest in business enterprises, etc. And therefore, if I can say, had and continues to have that unfair advantage over the blacks. So again, I'm using those examples and experiences to reinforce the fact that in my mind, anti-black racism is systemic, it was systemic, and it continues to be systemic. And while many of us might be of the opinion that it's practiced because of perhaps the color of our skin or hatred of our hair, it's my firm belief that this system has been put in place to ensure that those of us, the children of Africa, African descendants, remain economically downpressed, remain socially disadvantaged. Many will argue, especially you hear it all the time from our fellow Guyanese, I'm not racist. I don't hate blacks. I have black friends. But these utterances are usually used to, as we like to say, camouflage the fact that these very people participate in a system that is intended to keep us as a people downtrodden. Now, the fact that these discriminatory practices have been and continue to be in place to directly impact the lives of the African man and woman, there are certain effects which obviously, certain impacts which obviously will affect us as a people. What are some of those? We know in Guyana, for example, there's a wealth gap between people of Afro lineage and the other people. I would have heard and perhaps read that more than or almost 90% of the Guyanese wealth is controlled by a very small percentage, 1 or 2% of people who are not of African descent. The other 10% of that wealth is what is distributed among blacks and the other ethnic groups in this country. Now, when a group of people are denied the access to capital and opportunities for the upward mobility, there's no doubt that what will follow would be deviance, among other things. But let me continue to examine how that anti-black system has been rolled out in Guyana and its effect on us as a people. We talk about
Amsterdam.
Yes.
Just reminding you of the timings as well.
Okay. How many minutes do I have left?
You're past the time.
I passed the time?
Yes.
Oh, I'll just make this last point quickly, point or two.
No problem, no problem.
Now, we have seen as part of the anti-Black racism system, efforts aimed at undermining the education, the quality of education, which our youngsters are exposed to. We have seen, again, under the last government, we have seen the No Child Left Behind, where our youngsters have been consistently promoted through and out of the school system without the requisite learning. We have seen deliberate efforts to bring about the failures of the multilateral schools, which offered a multifaceted education to our children. We have seen the deliberate neglect of the President's College, perhaps because it was established under Black leadership, and perhaps because for the greater part, many of our Black scholars had the opportunity to be groomed there and be pointed in a direction of success. Now, when all of these things are put together, what we have as a result are members of our community who are deviant, who find themselves in the prison system because of petty and other crimes, and who make poor choices, which in the long run affect their health. And again, that comes right back into the economic chaos that we find ourselves in. I will leave that there. And as the discussion goes along, I'll be able to share with you, as part of the discussion, what have been some of my personal experiences. How have I been affected by the anti-Black racism system that has been operating in this country? Or if, as the moderator would like, I can continue and do that. Your choice.
Okay, Mr. Amsterdam. With time and the constraint, probably during the Q&A, that can be brought out.
Thank you.
No problem, Mr. Amsterdam. Before I get into Mr. Michael, please remember, if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A or chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, Mr. Ralph.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here this evening. Thank you to Mr. Amsterdam and my fellow panelists. You know, it's a great honor to be here. And I just want to say a little bit about my research, a little bit about how it connects to my personal experiences and how it might help provide us with some insights about things happening in Guyana and around the world at the moment. So as mentioned at the outset in the introduction, I do research on slavery, incarceration, forensics, and insurance. I would say if there's one question or theme that sort of ties my research together, it has to do with how do we decide how much a human life is worth, you know? And, you know, one of the main ways I think about that question has to do with insurance, but insurance is just a way to sort of gesture back to themes Mr. Amsterdam introduced, a way of thinking about what's valuable to us, about thinking about whether or not we're equal to each other and whether all lives mean the same thing, you know? And in the history of African people, obviously, you know, we've talked about sort of the history of the slave trade, the African diaspora, and the key moment for sort of public debate about what human life is worth happened in 1781. There was a British slave ship, the Zong, where the British captain realized he didn't have enough water for both the crew and the enslaved cargo, and he just threw 132 enslaved people overboard to be able to collect the insurance money. So often when we think about insurance as a proxy for what life is worth, we think about really horrific instances where someone could sort of just disregard human life and treat it very cheaply for insurance. But one thing we see that's fascinating in the history of slavery as well is the way that African people use their ingenuity to develop marketable skills and to enhance their value. Because as Mr. Amsterdam was saying, you know, often African people have been treated as property, but
but enslaved property is the only kind of property that can enhance its value over time based on skills that it learns. So what you see after the slave trade was outlawed in 1808, while slavery was still legal, was that people who could no longer acquire enslaved workers would often rent them from people who had them in abundance. And when they would rent them or rent them to other people, they would often insure them in case they died while they were in someone else's property. And you start to notice that the huge market opened up for insuring slaves who were rented, because people wanted to be able to collect the value of their asset if it died while in someone else's possession. And enslaved people who were insured included carpenters, blacksmiths, butlers, barbers, people who ran households, nurses, things like that, which proves that these enslaved people had acquired skills that had tremendous market value, which is an interesting kind of lesson that even under extremely oppressive circumstances, African people use their ingenuity to create value. I think one other facet of my research that is relevant to this conversation is the fact that life insurance took off. Just life insurance for ordinary people, for citizens, took off in many societies just as slavery was being outlawed. And this is kind of a strange paradox, because right when we sort of enter what we think of as free society, we start to see people developing life insurance policies as a way to sort of provide for their next of kin if something happens to them. And while we associate life insurance with free society and people take out life insurance contracts voluntarily, life insurance value in a policy is based on family medical history, risk factors, projected future wages, all things that favor people who've been free for a long time and disadvantage people who've been enslaved for a long time. So to Mr. Amsterdam's point again, you see that even, life insurance companies are charging newly emancipated African people in societies all over the world higher premiums for life insurance because they have weaker vital statistics, because they've been enslaved for a long time and they have lower life expectancy or a lot of medical problems. Even Black life insurance firms, which became some of the leading Black businesses in many societies after emancipation, would charge Black clients higher premiums because they have weaker vital statistics. So I just think that this question of how much a life is worth shows up in even the most mundane ways, like insurance policies, things that people take out without even thinking about them with too much depth. But they often provide a window into how societies think about how much different people's lives are valued. And I'll come back to that point. Another facet of my research has to do with forensics. And, we usually associate forensics with crime scenes and crime scene investigation. But of course, forensics is also another site for thinking about how much we value, like where value lies, because, for instance, if there's a traffic accident, there is a kind of investigation about who's at fault and who owes what to whom. So you could say that forensics to some level is a theory about who owes what to whom. And forensics is also related to life insurance because, when someone dies, there's always an investigation to decide, is it an accidental death? Is it a murder? If it's a murder, the family may get a life insurance policy. If it's a suicide, often the family does not. And famously, Malcolm X, the renowned leader and political activist, when his father was killed by the Ku Klux Klan in the US, it was ruled a suicide by the insurance company. So his mother and the family was not able to collect on the policy. So the question of how people die and under what circumstances people die and how people decide how someone dies is directly linked to value and the ability to build value. So, Malcolm's mother was from Grenada, and I think this sort of ties back into what I sort of want to discuss a bit, what it means to be Afro-Caribbean and in particular Afro-Guyanese. I've lived in different parts of the world. After Teachers College, my parents traveled from Guyana to University of West Indies, where they went to college. My dad then did a master's degree at University of British Columbia in Canada. My older brother was born in Jamaica. I was born in Canada. My younger brother was born in New York, where my parents went next. And, I've grown up in the diaspora. I've visited Guyana as well, but I've also sort of understood what it means to be Guyanese, what it means to be of African descent in different countries around the world. And I think, each place is distinct, each place is unique. But then as African people, we also have similar kinds of experiences as the video at the beginning laid out. And, I often tell people, if people ask me what it means to be a professor at a university, like New York University or in medical school, and I always say, like, everything happening outside the academy is also happening inside the academy, right? Like, we deal with racism and microaggressions from colleagues and students. We deal with discrimination and harassment. I've been harassed and discriminated against even by security and police officers going to my own office. And, you know, this conversation in particular about police harassment and abuse is obviously very pertinent right now in the world, and in the wake of the George Floyd protests, which have happened all over the globe, led chiefly by people of African descent, and in particular sort of the Black Lives Matter movement becoming something people refer to as a kind of way to think about this question of how African people are discriminated against. And I think, you know, this idea of Black Lives Matter is obviously connected to the points I want to make, because, you know, it's not just a metaphor. At some level, we're dealing with the fact that the reason why Black people can be discriminated against and the reason why Black people can be harassed and killed with impunity is because people often do not think that Black life is worth very much. And this is a question that's relevant to people of African descent, you know, around the world, but also in Guyana in particular. And at this moment, you know, we see a lot of political tensions that are partly linked to this question of how much Afro-Guyanese lives are worth versus the lives of other people. And the political tensions we see really pronounced in the country at this moment date back, obviously, to the moments following emancipation, where the British decided to import South Asian workers, largely because they refused to pay newly emancipated African workers what they deserve to make now as free citizens. And that decision to import South Asian workers or workers from elsewhere, rather than pay newly emancipated people a living wage, has led to a lot of kind of political tensions and conflict over the decades and over the century. And, you know, a lot of times people associate the experience of being Black in America with, you know, police killings of unarmed people. And of course, that's a reality we live with. But also in Guyana, we have disproportionate rates of extrajudicial killings of Black people, of Afro-Guyanese men dying in police custody, of disproportionate arrest and sentencing for crimes, of discrimination and trying to access credit for business loans and employment. So, you know, the question I sort of want to pose in closing, and I'd love to discuss further in Q&A, is why do these problems persist? You know, if we have thoughtful, illuminating analyses of these problems, why do they persist? And at least with the question of police violence, in particular in the US, one of the reasons ties back to insurance, because a lot of police departments in the US actually carry insurance policies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And often when they are found guilty, in the rare instance that they're found guilty of torturing or killing someone, they often just draw on their insurance policy to make a payment to the family of the victims or to the injured party. And it's precisely that idea that they can sort of capitalize their value and essentially take money from taxpayers to continue committing abuses is partly why it's so hard to achieve accountability. But I would say with the example of Guyana as well, the question to be asked is, who is it that directly profits from the exploitation of Afro-Guyanese, you know, in the sense that, you know, we're aware that often the reason why certain abuses persist is because people benefit from them monetarily, you know? So I think thinking about the question of, you know, how Black lives matter, how Afro-Guyanese lives matter in concrete terms, thinking about who stands to benefit, who profits from these dynamics, is often sort of a way to kind of generate insights about what's at stake and also how we might solve some of these problems. So I'll stop there to transfer to the next panelist, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rolfe. Mr. Daniels, over to you.
Good. I'm minded of the time constraint, so might I just quickly thank the organizers of IDPADA-G for the invitation to come here and share with you on a second occasion. Might I also commend my fellow panelists on their presentations and indicate to you that it's definitely a humbling experience to share this platform with you. Might I also thank the moderators and thank the viewers for commending, for sharing a fraction of their time with us. Now, I remember my aunts used to always say to me that you need to cut your hair in order to get a good job. You know, you need to cut your hair if you're going for any interview. If you want to go overseas, you need to cut your hair. At that time, I didn't have dreadlocks. I used to plait my hair then. And I remember I was deathly serious when I would say to them that, or they even threatened, as a matter of fact, to cut my hair when I was sleeping. And my response was, if any of you touch my hair when I'm sleeping, it's going to be real trouble when I wake up. And believe you me, I absolutely meant that, because for me, like, my hair was a form, my hair was and still is a form of my identity. And I couldn't understand why I must cut my hair in order to better position myself as a candidate for a job, why I must cut my hair if I want to travel. And I would ask, does anyone else have to cut their hair when, you know, they go for an interview, whether it be a job interview, whether it be at the embassy? And I would ask as well, you know, why is it that, you know, I must and we must be limited in this way? Now, even at that time, I didn't fully understand the dynamics of racism. Racism became, or the reality of racism perhaps dawned on me when I was in my late teens and early 20s. Now, anti-Blackness is really a distinct form of racism. The general attitude is really to lump racism into one class, racism against non-white persons. But anti-Blackness has a totally different connotation, perhaps from racism of other strands. And when we seek to lump racism in one class, it's really on par with the All Lives Matter movement. What we seek to do is delegitimize the unique experiences of people of African descent. And the experiences of people of African descent, I respectfully submit, are not on par with folks who experience other forms of racism, especially given the history of people of African descent and how, you know, we have been systemically marginalized. We have been transported into a system of slavery. That experience has not been the experience of everybody else. Now, when we look at anti-Blackness, as my co-panelists have observed, we really have to look at different strands of systemic inequalities. And for the Black community, we see systemic inequalities manifesting themselves in various areas of our lives. When you look at housing, for instance, if we were to isolate housing, even in the communities that are presumably homogeneous communities, look at where the houses occupied by predominantly Black people are located. It would, those houses would invariably be way down to the back of the communities, where you have poor roads, where water takes some time to reach, where electricity takes some time to reach. In terms of even healthcare, right, the ability of persons of African descent to access comparatively good healthcare is significantly diminished because of our lack of access to the financial resources. When you look at education, for instance, we have anti-Blackness manifesting itself in our access to quality education. And as Kidackie has indicated, one thing we would fall into error is if we don't acknowledge the fact across the world, and of course in Guyana as well, there is that racial health gap. And I personally have been prejudiced by that health gap in my pursuit of education. And I know of very many other persons of African descent who have similarly been prejudiced, and prejudiced for no other reason than our not having that organic access to the means of production, that organic access to a concrete economic base, not having access to even, as Kidackie has indicated, loan facilities, because we don't have the collateral to access these loans. So the ripple effects manifest themselves, as I've indicated, in housing, in education, and in healthcare as well. Now, as an attorney, I've had a rather unique experience, I would say, interacting with primarily young Black males in the criminal justice system. And coming out as an attorney, I have had significant challenges getting to where I am today, and even getting to become an attorney to begin with. And as a consequence of those challenges, I've made a commitment that I am going to assist wherever I can. And that assistance is being primarily in the justice system. And while I did not set out deliberately to channel that assistance in a certain direction, the harsh realities in our criminal justice system makes it virtually inevitable that that assistance has to be rendered primarily to persons who look like me. And I've been in court on very many occasions when I've seen young Black males, and I've made the observation that virtually every day I'm in court, I see an assortment of different Black faces. And the perception is that young Black males are prone to criminality. When we look at whether the video news or whether we look at the print media, we have all of these instances being reported of young Black males being prone to criminality, while we may have significantly more young Black males whose lives are channeled in a positive direction, who don't get that type of attention, that type of mention, right? We have the number of young Black males who are involved in the criminal justice system being singled out, and when they're being singled out from the perspective of being guilty of the acts that they have allegedly committed. My experience has been that very many young Black males, for want of representation and sometimes for want of competent representation, find themselves behind bars, not because they've committed these acts, but because they're stereotyped, they're randomly picked up, or some of them might be persons who've been introduced into the criminal justice system. So whenever something happens, the police invariably runs and brings them back. And I've seen, and I've stand on behalf of many young Black males, as I've indicated, who would have otherwise been committed to prison, who would have otherwise been remanded, because they don't have the ability to articulate effectively for themselves how they've gotten themselves in that mess, and they don't have the economic means to secure the representation that they need. And they're coming up against a system that is really focused and committed to ensuring that they are marginalized, that they don't have access to, as I've said, the means of production. They don't have access to that they don't have access to an education that benefits them in a way that the counterparts have. Now, other examples I might cite. There's a perception in the Black community, as Kidackie has again pointed to, that Black men are prone to certain attitudes. We're prone to sporting, we're prone to basically spiriting away the little monies that we earn, we're prone to laziness. If you look at our counterparts in the other ethnic groups, they too have a reputation for sporting, and that reputation may be perhaps more significant, or not reputation, their reality of sporting may be more significant than the reputation that the Black males have attracted, right? Their reality of not wanting to work hard may be more significant than the reputation that the Black males have amassed. Now, if you go into most of the construction sites, for instance, you would see that those sites are populated by predominantly young Black males who work really, really hard. You go into most of these manual labor sites, you would see that they're predominantly populated by the young Black males who are working hard. So the instances of deviant behavior, as Kidackie has styled it, in the Black community, those are amplified as though they spread across the Black community, while the success stories or the instances, the mirrored instances of hard work don't ever get the recognition and the attention that they deserve. I'm minded of my time constraints. I take it for granted that I've exhausted my time minutes, and I'll be more than happy to enlarge my contributions in the question and answer segment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniels, for that. I would also like to thank our panel for very informed contributions. And while Mr. Daniels was sharing about it here, I remember the story of Samson. As we go into our question and answer segment, if you have any questions, please shoot them in the Zoom chat, or if you have any questions on Facebook, please leave them on the Facebook comment section. But Mr. Daniels just shared how he uses his profession and his specific field of work to assist other African males and so forth. And this question is directed to Mr. Ralph and Mr. Amsterdam. How do you use your positions in your various fields to disrupt the narrative of anti-Blackness, as well as create a path for African males who may be coming after you?
I'm happy to jump in first. So I worked a lot with mentorship programs and, tutoring young people of all ages from elementary school up till most recently. I've been sort of advising students who are applying from undergrad, like college, to doctoral programs and graduate school programs. I also teach in a prison education program at NYU. So some of my students were formerly incarcerated. And what's interesting is that I've had students who told me they were the first men in their family to go to college. And what they mean is like taking a college class as someone who's incarcerated. That was the first person in their family to go to college. So, and right now I'm actually collaborating with someone who's incarcerated on a project. He's writing about what it means to be locked up during the age of COVID. And I just wrote him yesterday, but he and I are supposed to be collaborating on that. And then I'm also trying to put together like a political education and prison education platform with a friend that's going to be like a study guide and like resources for both students who are on college campuses or around the country, around the world, and also people who are incarcerated to kind of think and read together and study things that are relevant to the concerns we share.
Mr. Amsterdam?
How do I use my resources to help? That's what I think I heard, my paraphrasing. Well, I use every moment as a teachable moment. Every opportunity I get to speak with people in general, but young Black people in particular, I share my experiences. I involve within the community. I do a lot of mentoring, and I provide, if you can call it, a lot of support services to young people. Whatever their needs are, so long as they reach out, I make it my duty to assist so that they can move along the way and get the opportunity to achieving more than might be obvious to them. I take a lot of time to teach our young Black folks the importance of the education, the importance of valuing money, and the fact that which might be visible in the neighboring communities is not necessarily wealth that came overnight, but that was built from generation to generation, and encourage that where what you take a little bit, regardless of how small it is, and you set it aside. Old people like to save for rainy days, but I like to save for the next investment opportunity. So I try to bring all of those things together, my ability to teach, every opportunity that presents itself. I use them, and I try to teach not only the value for money, but respect for self, delayed gratification, and such important concepts that can necessarily bring about positive changes in the individual's lives and the community by extension.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amsterdam. Mr. Daniels, you have a question directed to you in the chat. How do you reconcile the fact that the post-colonial police has been primarily dominated by African Guyanese and the high level of incarceration of African Guyanese males?
That is quite an interesting question. Now, one of the things that the African society, the African Guyanese society, and I imagine the Afro society across the world has submitted itself to is internalizing this sense of inferiority. So the narrative of Black inferiority has been bandied around so often that we begin to believe that that is exactly whom we are, that we're not capable of more, perhaps we don't deserve more, perhaps we're not anybody's equal. And the police force is as populated as it is because those are that is among the jobs that that have been open to persons of to Afro-Guyanese. So you would see a higher concentration of Afro-Guyanese in the police force, and those who have the mandate to carry out of persons who are not of African descent who occupy those power positions, and they basically, like as I've indicated, carrying out the instructions that they're given. They're in tune with our stereotype that, the criminality is concentrated among the African community, And that is exactly, unfortunately, where they go and round up the band of African males.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniels, for that. We have another question in the chat from Patrick. This is directed to Mr. Amsterdam and Mr. Daniels. How do you see the role of protest or social agitation in reforming the system to better facilitate a more equitable system for African Guyanese? Mr. Amsterdam, I think your mic is muted.
Good, yes. So, sorry. You know, we big people in technology. Yes, I think protest and social agitation have very important roles to play in a reformation of the system, if I can call it that. In my own experience, I would have recognized that a lot has been given, or a lot of space have been created in this society only when the word boycott was uttered. When it came to Blacks and their concerns. And so from that experience and looking at what protests and agitation have been able to achieve across the world, I believe that it can serve us well in this society if we coordinate and execute properly. Protest and agitation has a meaningful role to play in the reformation of the system and the ideology of anti-Black racism in the Guyanese society.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amsterdam. Mr. Daniels, you want to take a crack at that question?
Sure, thanks. I need to observe that Guyana is really at that critical juncture, that electoral juncture, where there is uncertainty looming as to whom would form our next government. And we're at that juncture where the international community is taking a special interest in the affairs of Guyana and even overreaching on occasions. And this is just around the time when Black sentiments are really being heightened, where Black consciousness is really being heightened internationally and locally. So the role of protest is indispensable. And I'm minded that I would want to contextualize it like this here. Blacks in Guyana, especially Black males, have a legitimate fear that if the PPP administration were to return to government, that events of the past may replicate themselves. And I've heard these sentiments expressed by innumerable young Black males, the mothers of innumerable young Black males, the sisters and aunts of innumerable young Black males. So protesting as a tool and agitation, as I've indicated, is really indispensable because it brings attention to the issue, it brings attention to systemic inequalities for Afro-Guyanese, and it forewarns those who are waiting to retake the reins of power that this is not going, the time to come would not be the times of the past. You wouldn't have a dormant society, a dormant Afro-Guyanese society. And we've seen in the same election season how persons, especially businesses, have used their economic footing, right, to try to marginalize the African community by weaponizing their business. So protesting again is a pushback against even such economic domination. And we have to go a bit further than just protesting and agitating. We have to really pause to think where our dollars are being spent. It can't be just rhetoric and marching in the street anymore, while that is a good entry point. We have to start crafting the institutions, the parallel institutions, which provide everything that the Black community needs and support those institutions. And it is only when we have that type of system in place, then we have that footing that we can really start pushing back against the system, and we can really start opening the doors to social, political, and economic equality. Thank you.
And answer. We have a comment from the Facebook chat from Mr. Norwell Hines. I think it was in reference to the question that Patrick asked earlier. And he stated that the state is unreformed and was constructed to keep formerly enslaved in line. We also have another question in the chat box from Mr. Royston Peters. And this is directed to any member of the panel. What consideration do you have for agitating for the status of manumission as a people in the Guyana situation?
Let me go. In terms of agitating for manumission, there's no question. That in my mind is not even a question. There should be no second thought about us agitating. I read recently where I think it was a British church or business that participated in the slave trade basically apologized and said that they were willing to invest in Black communities to alleviate some of the problems of Black communities. I guess that's their way of quote unquote making it right. As a people, there's no doubt that our ancestors' labor was integral to the development of a whole host of these quote unquote superpowers. Certainly countries that are better off than most, that especially us in the Caribbean. And therefore, we ought to, as ancestors, as descendants of those who put their shoulders to the wheel and lost their lives and their freedoms to develop those economies, we ought to receive some of that benefit as compensation for the sufferings of our people. Like the scholars would have said, the sufferings of our ancestors obviously have had negative impacts on those of us descendants. And yes, it's my firm belief that not only as Guyanese, but Blacks across the continents ought to agitate and agitate consistently for manumission.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Amsterdam. Mr. Raul, this is directed to you. What are the hindrances to the advancement of African men today, and what are the key facets that are necessary for their empowerment and advancement?
I think the panelists have done a great job of sort of pointing to some of the key hindrances. And I just sort of wanted to add something actually to the last question that connects to this question as well. I think that there are a lot of structural barriers, obviously, in education, employment, even access to quality healthcare, access to loans for businesses, loans for schooling, that create all kinds of hindrances. And oftentimes when we talk about ways to rectify those situations, they're presented as fanciful or impractical, you know? And I just want to point out that, you know, in many cases, when we talk about large sums of money, whether it's sort of the debt that France imposed on Haiti after the revolution, or that the British government gave to former slaveholders when it abolished slavery, in many cases, those payments took decades or even over a century to proceed, right? Like, and the fact that those large sums of money were delivered over a century or over many decades didn't stop those governments or those people from making those contractual arrangements. So it's totally conceivable that there could be certain kinds of payments that are made to people who've suffered various kinds of injuries over time, even if it's a large sum of money, even if it takes an elaborate process to decide who gets what and how. And I think that oftentimes, instead of thinking of it as some kind of really daunting project, like let's say reparations or something like that, I think of it more in the most mundane sense, like car accidents and other kinds of atrocities, or even like bombings and accidental deaths where, you know, it's relatively easy to convene a commission to evaluate the atrocity, to decide how much money is available, to decide who gets paid what, you know? So I think that the example with life insurance was designed to say that while we think of human life as priceless, we often do put a price on it in very practical terms. So it's actually not rocket science. People do it every day. And so I think we should think in more creative and also more straightforward and practical ways about how to measure certain kinds of injuries and atrocities, and also what kinds of payments are deserved as a result. But I think maybe the main thing I recommend, obviously, is sort of like a clear and cogent analysis of the social and political landscape you're faced with, which includes sort of the economic considerations. And then also, I think the solution is more solidarity and more sort of mobilization, you know? And I think that this particular moment in Guyana's history is a crucial example of sort of what determined, clear analysis and mobilization will mean for the fate of the country, obviously. And so all that to say, I don't have anything particularly sort of unconventional to recommend except clear analysis, mobilization, and also, you know, I think the secret to capitalism is its creative accounting practices. I'll just leave it like that, you know. And this goes back to something Mr. Amsterdam was saying, just about corporate wealth and things like that. You know, how could it be that certain kinds of industries are not required to pay taxes at all, while ordinary people pay all kinds of taxes? This is just sort of about accounting and record keeping and creative strategies for accounting, which we're all capable of developing as well, I would say.
Excellent answer, Mr. Ralph. We have another question directed to you, Mr. Ralph, from our Facebook chat. Mr. Norwell Hines, he's asking, to what extent can traditional Afro-Caribbean systems, such as Susu Boksan, mitigate against how Black risk is assessed? And given the success of the Grameen Bank among poor Indian women, can these Black systems / Boksan be scaled up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, as I was thinking about solidarity and mutual aid, I was thinking about some of these societies people have put together on their own, or just kind of like networks amongst friends and family, like Susu and Box, that, like, you know, it's to save money, pool money, share resources. And I think those strategies have been invaluable and they're very important. But I also think that it's important to try to think about how to put those sums of money into some form where they can accrue more sort of compound interest and generate capital at a larger scale. And I think all the panelists are talking about some kinds of questions of scale. So while those things are really useful for survival, we could perhaps start to think about strategies that are a bit more imaginative than mere survival, and to think about how we can sort of like place those funds in something where we can benefit from that sort of sacrifice people are making, you know, because, you know, some of the panelists have pointed out already that Black people, even sort of in Guyana, Afro-Guyanese, tend to put their money in banks and savings, and savings, you know, sometimes people put a lot of money in savings that actually could go into investment. The problem is that people are scared, obviously, and also they don't necessarily have a lot to work with, and also these lending institutions aren't really accommodating. But, you know, for instance, even the IDPADA-G credit union and resources like that, I think, create the possibility for generating more capital. And I think also just sort of explaining, you know, sort of financial practices to people and helping to sort of like demystify them is a good strategy, I think, for sort of help people to benefit. But I do think the key is solidarity. So Susu and Box and any kind of collaborative savings project is actually the first step, because it shows a certain kind of commitment and determination to pool resources, which is often the problem. You know?
Okay, thank you so much, dear Mr. Ralph. This question is open to the panel. How then can we establish a chapter of Black Lives Matter movement in Guyana?
I think that in a sense, what IDPADA-G is doing is a step in that direction, while it may not be articulated as a Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is initially crafted around the wanton killings of persons of African descent in America. And that movement has now migrated internationally, not just in terms of lending solidarity to the American struggle, but being reinterpreted in various jurisdictions and being rearticulated. So I think what is important to the establishment of a Black Lives Matter movement in Guyana is articulating exactly what we want that to represent, and it must not be confined, I would submit, to just looking at issues of police brutality or extrajudicial killings, but to really redefine exactly what is a Black life, redefine why a Black life should matter, and to lay out ways and means the expressions of Black lives mattering. And IDPADA-G is doing something really amazing in that direction. Now more than ever, we're seeing that persons are engaged in conversations about Black lives, and persons are engaging, elevating Black lives, not just in a rhetorical sense, but we're seeing Black businesses springing up all across Guyana. We're seeing platforms that are being isolated exclusively for the promotion of Black businesses. We have platforms like these here, which are isolated for conversations of some of the experiences in the Black community and how we can really lift the psyche of the Black community. So I don't think it's just, I would hope that the inquiry is not just one of formation in terms of just establishing that physical Black Lives Matter organization, but one that focuses on the contents of that organization as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Mr. Daniel said 100%. And I would just add briefly that perhaps the best thing about Black Lives Matter as a concept is that it's really capacious. It doesn't really have like a really clear fixed content, and definitely doesn't have a fixed leadership. So it's really for activists on the ground to shape the struggle based on, as Mr. Daniel said, reinterpreting the struggle to encompass the needs of the people who are being served right locally. So, in that sense, I do also see what IDPADA-G is doing as a step in that direction. And I think it's, a great question in the sense that this is precisely, I think, part of that process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniels and Mr. Ralph. And just to add to the answers you guys give, IDPADA-G has been doing tremendous work in the African Guyanese community in the sense that we've been educating, we've been informing persons about our history, and we've also been trying to implement programs and policies to develop our community. So I would say that even before this current wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've been doing active work in our community, and we plan on continuing that and to even improve upon what we've done thus far. We have a comment in the Facebook chat. Ms. Zoe Jackson, one of our panelists from last week, is saying that The movement has expanded to a conversation on racial equity, which needs to happen in Guyana. Police violence is premised on racial bias and racism, issues that are avoided by Guyanese. And with that, I'll ask the panelists to give a final remarks. Please be brief. Anyone can go.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say, I think that one of the trickiest things about racism and about discrimination is that, you know, no one wants to think they're racist, obviously, and, you know, or very few people, you know, who hold presidential views and wield differential power would declare themselves to be racist or biased in any obvious or overt way. So I think that the question on the table is, you know, the political and economic ramifications of these institutions and how they work, and when they favor one group over another, and when they favored one group over another over and over again over many decades, and when there's power that's deeply entrenched. And also, I think, you know, one of the clearest signs of racism is that the legitimacy of anything Black, any kind of Black enterprise or operation is called into question, right? So just the idea that somehow it can't be governed with integrity if it's a Black institution, if it's a Black government or something like that. So I think what we ought to do is sort of attack those kinds of ideas at their root and just kind of create stable, enduring models of sort of how governance can proceed in a kind of just and unbiased way.
Yeah, I wanted to observe that it's interesting that we've been having the converse of that conversation, especially recently, instead of having a conversation on race equity and race equality. What we've been having is unrestrained expressions of racial hatred. And now more than ever, I think that we need to have that conversation, and not just amplifying the aspects of police violence, but we need to have that holistic conversation. That conversation need to be guided and not just left as it has been in the open space. So persons can basically deposit their hearts through their mouths. Right, our leaders, I think, need to step to the fore, or perhaps as we're doing here, we need to step to the fore and guide our conversation. So even while IDPADA-G is doing what it's doing and has been doing what it's doing since before the onset of the Black Lives Matter campaign, the educating the society about Blackness is not just for Black people, but it's for every race in our society that interacts with Black people. So we're saying in an honest and open way, these are some of the things that we're affected by. These are some of the resolutions we would like to see. And that is the same type of response or the same type of expressions that we want to invite from the other communities, and not just the toxic expressions which, you know, are charged at attacking persons instead of dealing with the issues we're confronting.
Thank you so much for that, guys. Right now we have a spoken word by Mr. Kibwe. Mr. Kibwe, over to you.
Yes, I'm here. Good night, everyone. Kibwe Copeland here. I first like to commend, of course, the organizers of IDPADA-G for putting together this, of course, something that has been ongoing, Spill the Facts. I commend, of course, the speakers, the panelists, Mr. Daniels, Mr. Ralph, and Mr. Amsterdam. I think the presentations were good. It also adds to the conversation. Of course, I know I'm supposed to be doing a spoken word. Well, might be a little twist to my spoken word. Basically some encouragement, basically, for Black men when it comes to ending up this discussion tonight. basically one of the things that I want persons to, especially for Black men, to consider is one that we always look at, people's hatred against us and how, we always advocate for persons to accept us as equal. And you look at the part of equity. And it's very important for us to also accept ourselves. Because one of the main problems, or I think one of the main, or the biggest problem among us as African people, first, is our acceptance of ourselves. Because at the end of the day, most of the persons out there are the same persons who we are maybe protesting against don't have any intentions of accepting us. Because of society, because of laws that have been implemented in today's society, of course, or in the modern world, they're just forced to, at some time, just to try to, make things seem like, they accept us or they want to plead to our cause. But really and truly, they don't want to. So it's very important for us as an African race to first work amongst ourselves, to accept ourselves for who we are. Know that as African men, we are powerful. As African men, we are strong, we're mighty, and that we accept our faults and we want to do better with ourselves. I think the whole notion of knowing better. But the main fact that you know that we're in a place whereby the world is against us. If the world is against us, then we should be for ourselves. But what I mean is that we should try to support ourselves, support our brother. Most of the times we have so much disunity among ourselves. Like, for example, so many organizations rising up to be the person, let's, for example, I'm the president of Kimbo, an organization for reparations, and I'm going to try to be, the top dog for that movement. And then there's going to be another organization, like, for example, IDPADA-G, trying to be the best. It's always a competition among each other, whereby we're supposed to be united, of course, moving forward. And I'm glad that at the youth level, I'm not trying to say that our seniors are disconnected or disunited, but at the youth level, I'm seeing that kind of cohesion amongst African organizations, whereby we're trying to push together to fight against the stigmas that has been placed against us. We must first know our worth and accept our worth and care less if anybody else accepts us. It first starts with us. I believe that if we can build ourselves as strong African men, as a strong African race, not excluding our women, and of course tonight's panelists or tonight's discussion is dedicated to men. If we can first look at our strengths and accept who we are and care less of what other people think about us and work on our strengths, how we can build each other, buy from each other, work with each other, support each other, I think that alone will not only gain respect from other people, but it would push us up far more better than us asking people to accept us. I think that's one of the main problems. Maybe I've had, a little mix up with what I was supposed to be doing tonight, because I heard spoken word and also heard affirmations, right? So I'm speaking off the head, not really with anything scripted, because I believe that this movement and what is going on around the world is something that I hold strong to my heart, and it's not something that I have to, put on any document or words or what. I think I can speak off the head from it, because I believe it's something that we all should be interested in, even though we have a large amount of young people who are not so interested in it, because you know what? They always say at the end of the day, I have to work, or at the end of the day, these issues are issues that, bothered us back then, and we should look forward. Not understanding what has happened to our foreparents in the past and what has happened to even to our own parents continue to affect us and will continue to affect our generations to come if we do not put a stop to it today. So we must affirm to ourselves our strength. We must look back to the strengths of our foreparents, and this is before slavery, because most of the time we look back at slavery as our main history book, which is one of the most horrific and unfortunate pasts in our history. We must look past that, look at what our foreparents have created before the enslavement. And we must, of course, look at our persons who have did great things even within our time. Look at the Martin Luther King, the Malcolm X, and these people who have done it. And we know there are just, there are few people that have really made an impact as African people. We have Rosa Parks and other African people that have made significant strides. And that's an example of what we can do. And, of course, I commend all of the movements that's going on across, of course, with George Floyd. Even in Guyana, we have faced, a lot of African people have been sidelined, discriminated. You can't come from Boxing and go and put your right address to apply for a job and these kind of things. We have seen how being an African person has been such a stain that we ourselves are even afraid to call ourselves Africans. We're glad to say, you know what, my hair is a bit curly, so I'm mixed with something else just to feel appreciated. And that is so sad. You know, our African men are seen as runaway fathers most of the time, not knowing that, you know, on enslavement, we were separated from our family. It was something that was actually forced upon us, that we don't understand it continues to play within our lives unknowingly. So I think it's time for us to affirm as African people that we matter, and we first must understand that we matter. It doesn't matter if somebody else doesn't see us as a strong race, or somebody else doesn't see us as being human, because of course we know some of the things that they've said about us, or some of the things that they believe about us. That shows exactly how they treat us, standing or sitting, or I should say stooling on our neck with a knee for 7 minutes would say exactly how people see us. But we must first affirm to ourselves who we are, know who we are, respect each other, and build that force against us. We have to see other people who would look against us or try to suppress us as the enemy, and not try to beg them to accept us, but to accept ourselves and build ourselves strong enough to fight against whatever they will want to bring against us. And that's why I commend the Black Panther movement. And I think that was one of the movements that I support, and I would support even until today, whereby African people came together to protect themselves, protect their communities, protect their wives, protect their children, protect their women, protect their men. African people looked at how they can come together and, you know, make that cage among each other and build each other up, then try to seek that acceptance from others. I believe that once you as a people find that social cohesion among yourselves first, build that strength economically, physically, mentally, spiritually among themselves, people will be forced to respect you because you'll be a force to be reckoned with. But if you are weak, and if you are just in the position whereby you're just saying, look, I'm human, please respect me. I'm human just like you. If you cut me to see the same blood, they don't care about all of that. They don't care if you cut you to see the same blood, if you could speak the same language. That's not their concern. You have to first build that strength amongst each other first. And that, of course, will not only give you respect, but people will be very skeptical of how they deal with you because they know of the strength and what you come with. But in a divided race, we'll always be treated the same way. Today, Black Lives Matter will bow down at some point. Someday down the line, another African boy or girl will be killed. And then another movement will rise up again where we try to fight for more acceptance, which I don't believe would be the best way to go. Not saying that what is being done today is wrong or shouldn't be done, but I believe there's much more that needs to be done. So I think that we as African people, and of course I'm speaking directly to African men because I believe African men have a very great role to play because we are the protectors, we are the fighters, we are the security to our women. Our women, of course, are the nurturers. They are there, of course, to hold us when we're in our weak times. But we have a responsibility to ourselves, to our race, and to everyone to our families, to make sure that we are strong. And I think there's so many misconceptions of what it is to be a man. You know, we look at so many other people try to frame or try to shape ourselves and what we should think, what we should be to be a man. You know, macho is being to control a woman or to beat a woman or to, gang up with your men. And it's so complex. But I think there's a need for Black caucuses, male caucuses exactly, to have this discussion among men, because I believe that we are one of the main loops or loopholes. So one of the reasons why we face some of the problems we face, because, we understand that the woman is very precious. The woman is very important. And most times, being a man, I can tell you that a man sometimes is one of the reasons why most women also fall on the other side or are torn into the evil women that they are. Not putting out that there aren't women who do the same, but men have a very pivotal role to play. And I think that we are failing our women and we are also failing our people. And I think it's very important for us to understand we also feel, we also sometimes are weak, even though we try to puff our chests up and behave like, we are in control of everything else. And understand we have issues. And once we can admit that we have issues as African men, we can then start to solve those issues. And then, of course, help to change the problems that we have today. So basically, that's coming down to the end of affirmation or poetry or poetry, however you would want to put it. I believe that we as a people, especially African men, have to first acknowledge our problems, acknowledge where we're faltering, acknowledging where we are at the bottom of the ladder and see how we can pull ourselves up. Not singularly, but basically hold our brother up by his hand, help each other economically, physically, spiritually, come together as a team and work towards equipping ourselves, building ourselves, strengthening ourselves, so people would see us as a force to be reckoned with, and not as a force that's begging for their acceptance or to make us equal like them, because we're not equal. We're never equal. We are Black, and they are who they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kibwe, for those affirmations. Spoken word is a bit of slip of the tongue, but that's all right. Excellent way to finish our proceedings for tonight. It's always good to look at not only the external environment, but to analyze our internal constitution and to evaluate whether we are being productive members of our society and whether we are encouraging and educating our own community. So thank you for that, Kibwe. I would like to say and express gratitude to all of our panelists, Mr. Ronald Daniels, Mr. Kidackie Amsterdam, and Mr. Michael Ralph for very informative and excellent presentations. I'm sure all of our attendees, both on the Zoom and the Facebook Live, were tremendously blessed with the information that you guys shared tonight. I would also like to encourage our attendees to visit our Facebook page, IDPADA-G Youth Movement. Like the page, share the page. You can visit our IDPADA-G Credit Union page as well if you're interested in the activities of the credit union. And I would also like to encourage you guys to tune in again next week, Thursday. We'll be delving into the topic, the origins of our race issues. And we have an excellent panel again next week that will be exploring that issue. So before we go, I know my co-host mentioned the spoken word earlier, and we do have a spoken word. It's going to come from Mr. Cleon Haley. So I want to say thank you again to everyone that has tuned into our program tonight, and do enjoy this spoken word, and do come right back here next week, Thursday, for another session of Spill the Facts.
Yes, it's a question. What have I done to you? Oh, you don't know me? Okay, take a good look. What have I done to you? All right, let me introduce myself. I am Melanie. I said it. I am melanin. All I have done in this life is exist like everyone else, minding my own business, doing my own thing, grinding for my dollar, working hard, blood, sweat, and tears, trying to raise a family, trying to be a good man in society, but yet still you come after me like I'm some parasite. So the question is, what have I done to you? While you're pondering on that, I dare you to find one reason that justifies your actions towards me, other than the fact that I am melanin. See, daily I find it difficult to breathe because this melanin is being suffocated by all the toxic lack of melanin, chest pounding, chin up high, speaking snow white privilege, and sometimes off-white or cream breath takers who are bent on sending this melanin on a visit to the undertakers. I can't breathe. What have I done to you? See, I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm just here to tell you, let this melanin breathe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cleon Haley, for that excellent spoken word. And as he ended the spoken word with the statement, let this melanin breathe, I would like to say good night, everybody, and to ensure that you let this melanin breathe. Thank you.